Chapter 1. The First Flicker. The air held a biting chill as the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the Norwegian wilderness in pristine white. The sky, heavy with clouds, threatened an unrelenting storm, but within this harsh landscape, a small, remote village nestled along a frozen fjord stood steadfast against the encroaching winter. Life here was isolated, timeless, with traditions carried forward like whispers through generations. The villagers spoke of the northern lights as if they were alive, spirits dancing across the heavens, offering glimpses of destiny to those who dared to watch. Among the few scattered homes, a young woman named Ingrid lived in a modest cabin at the edge of the forest. Her days were marked by the rhythm of solitude and survival. She tended to her small garden, now hidden beneath snow, and fished by the fjord's icy edge. Her life was simple but lonely, as she bore the weight of unspoken dreams and the ache of a heart that had never truly known love. Her parents were gone, lost to the harshness of the land, leaving her with only stories of her mother's laughter and her father's songs about the lights. It was during one of her routine walks into the woods, a place she often sought for solace, that Ingrid first sensed the change. The forest felt different, alive, humming with an energy she couldn't place. The tall pines swayed gently despite the still air, their icy branches sparkling under the dim light of an overcast afternoon. She stopped, her boots crunching against the snow, and gazed upward. Through a break in the thick clouds, a faint ribbon of green shimmered briefly before vanishing. It was the first flicker of the aurora that season, and though fleeting, it ignited a spark within her. As night fell, Ingrid returned home to her cabin, lighting the fire that cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls. She couldn't shake the feeling the flicker had left her with, a sense of anticipation, as though the sky had whispered her name. The villagers often spoke of the lights as harbingers of change, of love, of hope. Yet Ingrid had always dismissed these tales, grounding herself in the tangible realities of her isolated life. But tonight, as she sat by the crackling fire, a tiny, unbidden hope began to thaw the icy walls she had built around her heart. Far away, across the fjord, another soul wandered beneath the same restless sky. Elias, a traveler with no fixed home, had arrived in the village that morning. The sharp lines of his face bore the mark of a man accustomed to searching, though for what, he could never truly say. His journey had brought him northward, to this remote corner of the world, driven by an inexplicable pull toward the lights he had heard of but never seen. There was a yearning in him, too, a longing for something beyond the vast emptiness that had followed him for years. Elias had set up camp near the edge of the fjord, his small tent a lonely beacon against the endless snow. He stood outside, bundled in layers against the cold, his breath misting in the frigid air. Overhead, the clouds began to part, revealing a sky scattered with stars. He waited, his eyes scanning the heavens, as if the answer to his restlessness lay somewhere among them. And then, it happened. The same fleeting flicker of green that Ingrid had seen hours before. It was faint but undeniable, a beckoning light that stirred something deep within him. Though their paths had not yet crossed, the flicker marked the beginning of a connection neither could have anticipated. The lights, with their ethereal beauty and ancient mystery, were aligning destinies under their spectral glow. As the night deepened and snow continued to fall, Ingrid and Elias, two strangers bound by longing, unknowingly took their first steps toward one another. The forest and the fjord remained silent witnesses to the unfolding story. Somewhere in the vast expanse of winter's embrace, the lights waited, promising both the ache and wonder of love yet to come. Chapter 2. A Sky Divided. The sun barely grazed the horizon before retreating, casting the land into a twilight that seemed endless. Days were short in this part of the world, and the creeping darkness brought with it an otherworldly stillness. Ingrid ventured out of her cabin, wrapped in her thick wool coat and scarf, her breath puffing in pale clouds against the biting air. She carried a small lantern that barely illuminated the path ahead, its flickering light reflecting off the ice-crusted trees. Tonight, something drew her to the fjord, a pull as magnetic as the auroras that painted the sky in her dreams. The path she followed was familiar, worn by years of solitary walks. Each step crunched against the frozen ground, and the sound echoed in the silence. The fjord lay ahead, an expanse of frozen water framed by towering mountains cloaked in snow. The moon, a pale crescent, hung low in the sky, casting a faint glow over the icy expanse. It was a place of stark beauty, both desolate and breathtaking, and it never failed to make Ingrid feel both insignificant and profoundly connected to the world around her. As she reached the water's edge, she set her lantern down and gazed upward. The clouds had begun to clear, revealing a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly close, as if she could reach out and touch them. She stood there for a long time, her thoughts quieted by the majesty of the night. And then, as if the heavens had been waiting for her, the aurora began its dance. It started as a faint glow on the horizon, a pulse of green that gradually spread, weaving ribbons of light across the sky. Shades of violet and blue joined the display, their movements fluid and hypnotic. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the lights before, of course. Every winter brought their fleeting brilliance, but tonight they felt different, alive, purposeful. She raised a gloved hand toward the sky, as if to capture the light, and for a moment, she felt as though it might reach back. Across the fjord, Elias sat outside his tent, a small fire crackling before him. The icy winds threatened to extinguish it, but he shielded the flames with his body, his eyes fixed on the sky. He had been drawn northward by tales of the aurora, but no story had prepared him for this. The lights moved with a grace that defied explanation, their colors shifting and blending in ways that seemed almost deliberate. He felt a strange sense of intimacy with them, as though they were whispering secrets meant only for him. Elias leaned back, resting on the snow-covered ground, and let his mind wander. His life had been a series of restless journeys, each one promising something that remained just out of reach. He had chased horizons, climbed mountains, crossed oceans, and yet he had always returned to the same gnawing emptiness. But here, under this celestial display, he felt something stir, a quiet hope, fragile but undeniable. The lights seemed to mirror the yearning in his heart, their beauty both aching and exhilarating. Unbeknownst to him, Ingrid stood on the opposite shore, lost in her own reverie. Though separated by the frozen fjord, the lights above linked their worlds, casting the same glow upon their faces. It was as if the aurora were a bridge, spanning the distance between their hearts, though they remained strangers to one another. Ingrid lingered until the cold began to seep through her layers, urging her to return home. She picked up her lantern and turned back toward the forest, her heart strangely light despite the solitude that awaited her. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lights had been speaking to her, though she didn't understand their language. Elias, too, finally retreated to the warmth of his tent, though sleep did not come easily. He lay awake, his mind replaying the dance of the aurora, each movement etched into his memory. He thought of the stories he had heard, of how the lights were said to guide lost souls and bring lovers together. He had never believed such tales, but tonight, beneath the glimmering sky, he wondered if they might hold a fragment of truth. Though neither of them knew it, their paths were already beginning to converge. The lights had set something in motion, a quiet unfolding that would bring them closer with each passing day. The frozen fjord, the ancient mountains, and the endless sky bore silent witness to their journeys, waiting for the moment when their lives would finally intertwine. Chapter 3: Winds of the Unknown. The morning dawned in shades of muted gray, the sun hidden behind a veil of low-hanging clouds. A gentle snowfall had begun overnight, leaving a fresh blanket of powder across the landscape. The air was crisp and heavy with the scent of pine, a fragrance that seemed to anchor Ingrid in this place she had always called home. She stood on the porch of her cabin, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fjord lay quiet, its surface glazed with frost, and the forest beyond seemed to beckon her with a stillness that was anything but silent. Her routine rarely varied. Chores in the morning, long walks in the afternoon, and quiet evenings spent by the fire. Yet today, there was a restlessness in her chest, a stirring she couldn't quite name. The lights from the previous night lingered in her mind, their colors and movements vivid as though imprinted on the inside of her eyelids. It felt as though they had been trying to tell her something, and she couldn't shake the sensation that something was about to change. By mid-morning, Ingrid had donned her boots and cloak and set out into the forest. The snow crunched beneath her feet, and her breath formed brief clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. She carried a small satchel filled with provisions, some bread, a flask of tea, and a sketchbook she rarely used but always brought with her. The forest was a place of solace for her, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the rhythm of nature. But today, the forest felt different. The trees seemed taller, their shadows longer, and the air carried an expectant hush that made her footsteps sound unnaturally loud. She wandered deeper into the woods, following no particular path. The trees closed in around her, their branches heavy with snow, and the light grew dimmer as the clouds thickened overhead. The world seemed to narrow, focusing her attention on the small details. The delicate patterns of frost on a fallen leaf, the faint tracks of a fox winding through the snow, the soft murmurs of the wind as it passed through the pines. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet music that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Meanwhile, Elias was breaking camp on the opposite side of the fjord. He had spent the morning packing his gear, his mind preoccupied with the decision of where to go next. The wilderness was vast, and though he had no destination in mind, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest across the frozen water. Something about its dense, shadowed expanse called to him, as though it held answers to questions he had yet to ask. He secured his pack and began the trek across the fjord. The ice groaned beneath his weight, the sound reverberating through the stillness like a warning. He tested each step carefully, his boots crunching against the brittle surface, his breath clouding the air in steady bursts. The journey was slow and deliberate, each step a small act of trust in the unseen forces that held the ice together. When he reached the opposite shore, the forest loomed before him, its pines standing like sentinels against the cold. The woods enveloped him as he ventured inside, the snow muffling his footsteps. He moved with purpose, but without direction, following the quiet whispers of the wind as it guided him deeper. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a lattice that filtered the light into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. He paused often to take in the details, the intricate designs of ice clinging to bark, the faint chirps of birds that seemed almost hesitant to break the silence. Unbeknownst to each other, Ingrid and Elias were drawing closer, their paths winding through the forest like threads on a loom. The wind carried their scents, their unspoken thoughts, weaving an invisible connection between them. It was as if the forest itself conspired to bring them together, its ancient roots and towering trees playing silent matchmaker. Ingrid paused by a frozen stream, her reflection fragmented by the cracked ice. She knelt to touch the surface, her fingers tingling from the cold. The stream seemed alive beneath the ice, its water moving sluggishly but purposefully, as though it too felt the pull of the season. She closed her eyes and listened to the faint gurgle, letting it soothe her restless heart. At the same time, Elias stumbled upon the same stream, several meters downstream. He crouched to examine it, the faint tracks of a deer imprinted in the snow nearby catching his eye. He followed the stream for a short distance, its icy ribbon leading him through the trees. It was then that Ingrid sensed it, a presence, faint but undeniable. She straightened and scanned the woods, her heart quickening. She couldn't see anyone, but the silence had shifted, filled now with an energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She felt as though the forest were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias, too, felt it. He slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he searched the shadows. The forest was alive in a way that defied explanation, its stillness crackling with anticipation. He moved forward, each step deliberate, his senses heightened. And then, as if by design, they saw each other. Across the stream, their eyes met, the distance between them both vast and non-existent. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the forest holding them in its embrace. Neither moved, each caught in the spell of the other's gaze. The stream gurgled softly between them, the only sound in a world that had suddenly narrowed to this one singular moment. Ingrid's breath hitched, and Elias felt his heart skip a beat. The forest exhaled, its sigh rustling through the pines, as if it had been waiting for this all along. And in the stillness, beneath the snow-laden branches and the endless gray sky, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet promise, a fragile beginning. Chapter 4. Through Glacial Silence. The forest felt different after that encounter, as though it had shifted subtly to accommodate a story that had been waiting to unfold. Ingrid stood frozen at the edge of the frozen stream, her heart pounding in her chest. The stranger had lingered in her sight for only a moment before disappearing into the dense pines, but the intensity of his gaze had left a mark, like a fingerprint on her soul. She couldn't recall ever seeing anyone like him before. His rugged features, and the way he seemed to belong to the forest as much as the trees and snow. The moment replayed itself in her mind as she made her way back toward her cabin, the crunch of snow beneath her boots grounding her in the present. The stream gurgled softly behind her, a faint, melodic sound that seemed to call her back, but she pressed forward, her thoughts tangled with questions. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why had her heart reacted as though it recognized him, even when her mind insisted he was a stranger? Elias, meanwhile, had retreated deeper into the woods, his thoughts just as restless. He hadn't meant to linger, but the sight of the woman had rooted him to the spot. There had been something in her eyes, a quiet strength, a depth that seemed to mirror the forest itself. He had felt an inexplicable pull toward her, a magnetic force that both intrigued and unsettled him. He couldn't shake the sensation that their paths had crossed for a reason, though he had no idea what that reason might be. He stopped to rest beneath a towering pine, its branches heavy with snow. The wind whispered through the needles, carrying with it the faintest scent of firewood and earth, a reminder of the life he had glimpsed across the stream. He leaned back against the rough bark, his breath forming clouds that dissolved into the crisp air. The forest was quiet now, its earlier restlessness having settled into a watchful stillness. He felt as though it were holding him in its gaze, waiting to see what he would do next. Far away, Ingrid reached the edge of her cabin's clearing. She paused, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings as though seeing them anew. The cabin looked smaller in the growing twilight, its windows glowing faintly with the warm light of the hearth inside. The sight usually filled her with comfort, but tonight it felt different, less like a sanctuary and more like a stage for something yet to come. She stepped inside, shedding her cloak and boots before stoking the fire to life. The flames crackled and danced, their heat chasing the chill from the room, but the questions in her mind remained unanswered. Later that evening, Ingrid sat by the window, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. She rarely drew anymore, though she had once loved it, back when life felt simpler and the future seemed wide open. Tonight, however, she felt compelled to put pencil to paper. She let her hand move without thought, the lines and shapes forming almost of their own accord. When she finally looked at what she had drawn, her breath caught. It was the stranger, the man from the woods. She had captured him with uncanny accuracy, from the rugged lines of his face to the way his eyes seemed to hold secrets. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She closed the sketchbook and set it aside, unable to look at it any longer. The firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows on the walls, and she felt a sudden weight of loneliness that she hadn't noticed before. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting back to the forest, to the stream, to him. Elias, too, found himself unable to shake the memory of her. He set up camp beneath the same pine tree where he had stopped earlier, his small fire a meager defense against the biting cold. The flames danced in his eyes as he stared into the distance, his mind filled with images of the woman. He had no name for her, no story to attach to her face, but the feeling she had awakened in him was undeniable. It was as though the forest had reached into his chest and planted a seed, one that would grow whether he wanted it to or not. The night deepened, and the forest came alive with its nocturnal symphony. The rustle of branches in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint howls of wolves carried on the breeze. Both Ingrid and Elias lay awake in their respective shelters, their thoughts mirroring each other in their restless curiosity. The stars above shone cold and bright, their light filtered through the veil of snow-laden clouds. Ingrid eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and glimpses of light. She dreamed of the stream, its icy surface cracking beneath her feet as she walked across it, only to find herself face to face with the stranger once again. His eyes burned with an intensity that made her heart race, but before she could speak, he turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving her alone on the cracking ice. Elias, too, dreamed of the stream. In his dream, it wasn't frozen but flowing freely, its waters dark and deep. He saw the woman standing on the opposite bank, her hand outstretched as though beckoning him to join her. He stepped into the water without hesitation, the cold biting into his skin. But before he could reach her, the current swept him away. When morning came, both awoke with a sense of unease, the dreams lingering in their minds like smoke. The forest was quiet once again, its stillness deceptive, as though it were holding its breath. Ingrid stepped outside to gather firewood, her eyes scanning the tree-line as though expecting to see him again. Elias packed up his camp and began to move, his steps guided not by logic but by instinct. And so, the forest continued its quiet work, drawing them closer together with every passing moment, its ancient wisdom weaving their stories into one. The snow fell softly, erasing their footprints as quickly as they were made, but the connection between them grew stronger, invisible and unbreakable. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Snow. Morning broke with a pale sun casting a diffused glow over the snow-laden forest, its light struggling to penetrate the dense canopy of pine and birch. Ingrid awoke to the chill of dawn creeping through the cracks of her cabin, the fire reduced to a heap of smoldering embers. She pulled a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders, her breath visible in the frosty air. Her dreams from the previous night clung to her consciousness, fragments of shadowy figures and the echo of flowing water lingering at the edges of her thoughts. Determined to shake the unsettling feelings, she busied herself with her morning routine. She fetched water from the stream, the icy cold stinging her hands even through her gloves, and prepared a simple breakfast of bread and honey. The forest seemed quieter than usual, its stillness unnerving. The wildlife that often stirred at dawn remained hidden, as though holding its collective breath. Ingrid couldn't help but glance toward the tree-line, her eyes searching for movement. She told herself it was foolish to expect him, the stranger, to return, but her heart betrayed her with its quickened rhythm each time the wind rustled the branches. Far away, Elias was already awake, moving through the forest with the practiced silence of someone who knew its rhythms well. The forest, once his refuge, now felt charged with a new energy, as though it were guiding him somewhere he didn't yet understand. He had no destination in mind, but his instincts pushed him onward, deeper into the snowbound wilderness. His thoughts wandered back to the woman by the stream, her image etched into his mind like a carving on stone. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't even learned her name, yet she occupied his thoughts as though they'd known each other for years. As the hours passed, the forest began to shift subtly. The light grew dimmer, clouds thickening overhead, and the temperature dropped further. Ingrid noticed the change as she worked outside, stacking wood for the night ahead. She paused, her hands resting on the axe handle, and looked up at the sky. Snow was coming. She could feel it in the air, a tingling sensation that prickled her skin. The thought filled her with unease. A snowstorm in these parts could be merciless, cutting off paths and leaving one isolated for days. She hurried to finish her tasks, her movements quick and efficient, but her mind drifted. As she worked, she felt a strange pull, an unexplainable urge to return to the stream where she had seen him. She fought the feeling, telling herself it was nonsense, but it lingered like an itch she couldn't scratch. Finally, unable to resist, she set down her axe and donned her cloak, the need to follow the impulse overwhelming her. Elias, too, felt the change in the weather, but he welcomed it. The forest came alive in the snow, its stark beauty magnified by the pristine white that blanketed the ground and clung to the branches. He moved with purpose now, as though he could sense something waiting for him just ahead. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the faintest sound of running water. It was the stream, he realized, and his pace quickened. When Ingrid reached the stream, she found it transformed. The surface that had been frozen solid the day before now showed patches of flowing water, the current visible beneath the thinning ice. Snow began to fall lightly, the flakes settling on her hair and shoulders as she stood at the edge. She stared at the water, her reflection distorted by the ripples, and felt an odd sense of anticipation, as though something was about to happen. Elias emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the stream, his movements quiet and deliberate. He saw her immediately, her figure framed by the snow and the muted light. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But the pull he had felt all day, the invisible thread that seemed to connect them, drew him closer. He stepped to the edge of the water, his boots crunching softly on the snow. Ingrid looked up, her breath catching in her throat when she saw him. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of her emotions. Fear wasn't among them. Instead, there was curiosity, intrigue, and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. They stood in silence, the stream flowing between them, the snowfall thickening around them like a veil. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the world around them fading into the background. The forest, the snow, the cold, they all seemed distant, irrelevant. It was just them, two strangers bound by something neither could explain. Ingrid took a step forward, her boots sinking into the soft snow, but the ice beneath creaked ominously. She stopped, unsure of what to do. Elias raised a hand, as though to warn her, but he didn't speak. The stream was treacherous in its half-frozen state, and he didn't want her to risk crossing. Instead, He stepped closer to the edge, his eyes never leaving hers. He felt the urge to say something, to bridge the gap between them, but the words wouldn't come. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, alive with unspoken possibilities. The moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind, scattering snowflakes into the air and rattling the branches above. Ingrid shivered, the cold finally piercing through her layers of clothing. She glanced toward the forest behind her, torn between staying and leaving. Elias could see the hesitation in her eyes and felt a pang of frustration at his own inability to act. But he knew this wasn't the time. Not yet. Ingrid finally turned and walked away, her footsteps crunching softly as she disappeared into the trees. Elias watched her go, his chest tight with emotions he didn't fully understand. He stayed by the stream for a while longer, the snow falling steadily around him, before retreating into the forest. That night, as the snowstorm raged outside, both of them sat by their respective fires, their thoughts filled with the encounter by the stream. The connection between them had deepened, though neither of them could say how or why. The forest, silent and watchful, seemed to hum with approval, its ancient wisdom guiding their steps even as they remained unaware of its intentions. The storm howled outside, but inside, both Ingrid and Elias felt a strange, unexplainable warmth. Chapter 6. Auroral Secrets. The storm that had raged through the night left a crystalline world in its wake. Trees bowed under the weight of the snow, their branches sparkling with frost in the early morning light. Ingrid stood by her cabin window, the glass fogging slightly as she exhaled. She watched the muted forest, its silence heavy and profound, and felt a quiet ache in her chest. The events of the previous day haunted her. The fleeting connection across the stream, the stranger's gaze like a distant fire warming her from within. She turned away from the window and busied herself with chores, hoping to distract her restless mind. The cabin was filled with the scent of cedarwood and the faint tang of snow that clung to her boots. She fed the fire, its crackling the only sound breaking the silence, and swept away the fine layer of snow that had crept in under the door during the storm. Yet her thoughts always returned to him. Who was he? What had drawn him to the stream at the same moment she had felt compelled to go there? Far across the forest, Elias woke to a similar restlessness. The storm had sealed his small cabin in a cocoon of snow, its windows rimed with frost. He lit a fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls, and prepared a meal of dried meat and porridge. The simple routine, once comforting, now felt hollow. His mind kept wandering to the woman by the stream, her figure framed by snowflakes, her presence inexplicably magnetic. Elias felt a pull again, the same unspoken urging that had led him to the stream before. The forest, with its labyrinth of paths and secret clearings, seemed to be whispering to him, guiding him toward something he couldn't yet name. He dressed warmly, layering fur and wool against the biting cold, and stepped outside. The world was dazzling in its winter brilliance, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he began to walk. Ingrid, too, felt the stirrings of restlessness. She bundled herself in her thickest coat and fur-lined gloves, her breath puffing in white clouds as she stepped out into the crisp morning. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before, its silence carrying a sense of anticipation. She followed a path that led away from her cabin, her boots leaving neat prints in the fresh snow. The air smelled of pine and ice, clean and sharp, filling her lungs with every breath. Their paths, though separated by miles, felt intertwined. Each step they took seemed to echo the others, their movements synchronized by some unseen force. The forest, vast and unyielding, seemed to conspire to bring them closer, its ancient rhythms guiding their steps. As Ingrid walked, she noticed subtle changes in the forest. The light filtered through the trees in strange patterns, casting shifting shadows on the ground. The snow beneath her boots seemed untouched, pristine, as though no one had walked these paths in years. She paused by a fallen tree, its surface dusted with snow, and felt the faintest tremor in the air, a vibration that seemed to resonate in her chest. Elias, on the other side of the forest, felt it too, a subtle hum, like the distant echo of a song carried on the wind. It wasn't a sound he could hear with his ears, but something deeper, more primal, that he could feel in his bones. He stopped in a clearing, the sky above him painted with pale streaks of pink and gold as the sun climbed higher. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint rustling of snow falling from the branches. The aurora came early that evening, its colors streaking across the sky in ribbons of green and purple. Ingrid had returned to her cabin by then, lighting a lantern to ward off the encroaching darkness. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the northern lights. They seemed alive, their colors shifting and blending in a dance that felt both ancient and eternal. She felt a pang of longing, not just for the stranger she had seen, but for something larger, something she couldn't name. Elias watched the aurora from the edge of a frozen lake, his breath catching at the sight. The lights reflected off the ice, creating a surreal, otherworldly tableau. He felt small beneath the vastness of the sky, yet at the same time, he felt connected to the earth, to the forest, to her. He didn't know where she was, but he felt certain she was watching the same lights, feeling the same sense of wonder. The aurora seemed to bridge the distance between them, its colors weaving an invisible thread that bound their fates. Ingrid felt it as she sat by the window, her heart heavy with unspoken emotions. Elias felt it too, his chest tightening with a longing that was as profound as it was inexplicable. They were two souls adrift in the same storm, their paths converging like the streaks of light in the sky. As the night deepened, the aurora faded, leaving the forest bathed in moonlight. Ingrid pulled a blanket around her shoulders, her thoughts a tangle of hope and uncertainty. Elias began the long walk back to his cabin, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the stillness. Neither of them knew what the coming days would bring, but they felt the quiet certainty that their paths were destined to cross again. The forest, vast and silent, held its secrets close, but its ancient wisdom guided their steps. The aurora, fleeting and beautiful, had left its mark, a reminder of the connection that bound them, a connection as fragile and powerful as the light itself. Chapter 7: A Glow Between Worlds. The air was sharper that evening, colder than it had been in weeks, and the forest seemed to draw closer as Ingrid stepped outside her cabin. The sky was a canvas of brilliant stars, their light scattered across the heavens like grains of silver dust. She pulled her woolen scarf tighter around her neck and began her nightly walk, a ritual she had adopted to quiet her restless thoughts. Each step crunched against the frozen ground, and the sound echoed faintly through the stillness. The forest around her appeared different under the starlight. Shadows shifted, deepening in the hollows of trees and stretching long across the snow. Ingrid had always found comfort in the solitude of these woods, but tonight they felt alive, as though they were watching her. She paused to catch her breath, her exhalation clouding in the icy air, and tilted her head to the sky. The stars seemed impossibly close, their light piercing and eternal. Miles away, Elias stood at the edge of the same forest, his breath forming small puffs as he surveyed the darkened trees. Something had drawn him out tonight, an unshakable pull he could neither name nor resist. He had spent much of his life trusting his instincts, and tonight was no exception. The feeling in his chest was familiar, a call, a summons, but it carried a new urgency, a sense that the answers he sought lay just ahead, somewhere in the embrace of the shadowed woods. The snow glistened underfoot as he began his trek, the world around him eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, its usual song silenced by the weight of the night. His lantern cast a warm, flickering glow, but it seemed too small against the vastness of the forest. Yet Elias moved forward, his steps deliberate, as though he knew the forest would eventually reveal its secrets. Unbeknownst to them both, their paths were once again converging. The stars above seemed to weave an invisible thread between them, a silent song that resonated in the depths of their hearts. Ingrid felt it as she walked, her pace quickening without reason, her feet following a path she didn't consciously choose. She had no destination in mind, yet she moved with purpose, her instincts guiding her deeper into the forest's embrace. Elias felt the same pull, his steps steady as he ventured further into the woods. The towering trees, their branches heavy with snow, seemed to part before him, revealing a narrow trail bathed in starlight. He followed it without hesitation, the rhythm of his heartbeat matching the steady crunch of his boots against the snow. The cold bit at his face, but he barely noticed, his focus entirely on the path ahead. As Ingrid walked, she noticed a faint melody drifting through the trees. It was barely audible, more a sensation than a sound, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She stopped, turning her head to locate the source, but the forest remained silent. The melody, if it had ever been real, faded into the stillness. Shaking off the feeling, she continued, though her steps were slower now, more cautious. Elias, too, heard something, a faint hum, low and resonant, like the echo of a forgotten song. He paused, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the snow, and strained to listen. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, blending with the whispers of the trees. It stirred something deep within him, an ache he couldn't explain. He pressed on, drawn by the faint thread of music that seemed to call his name. Their paths finally brought them to a clearing, hidden deep within the forest. Ingrid reached it first, her breath catching at the sight. The snow-covered ground sparkled like diamonds under the starlight, and at the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak, its branches bare but imposing. She approached cautiously, her boots sinking slightly into the soft snow, and placed a gloved hand on the tree's rough bark. It felt warm beneath her touch, pulsing faintly as though alive. Moments later, Elias emerged from the shadows, his lantern casting its glow across the clearing. He froze at the sight of her, his breath hitching as recognition dawned. She turned at the sound of his approach, her eyes widening as they locked with his. The connection between them was instantaneous, as undeniable as the stars above. Time seemed to stop, the forest holding its breath as they stood on opposite sides of the ancient oak, their gazes locked. Though neither spoke, an unspoken understanding passed between them, carried by the silent song of the stars. The clearing, bathed in starlight, seemed to belong to another world, a place untouched by time. The air between them hummed with energy, and the faint melody they had both heard earlier seemed to swell, filling the space with its haunting beauty. Elias stepped forward, his lantern swaying slightly in his hand, and Ingrid mirrored his movement. They met at the base of the tree, the ancient oak standing as a silent witness to their union. For a moment, they simply stood there, the weight of the universe pressing down on them, yet lifting them up at the same time. The stars above seemed to burn brighter, their light illuminating the clearing with an otherworldly glow. Ingrid felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Elias felt it too, the ache in his chest easing as he stood beside her. They didn't need words. Their connection was deeper than language, rooted in the shared rhythm of their souls. The forest around them remained silent, its secrets hidden in the shadows, but the clearing felt alive, humming with the energy of the stars and the earth. As the night deepened, the ancient oak seemed to pulse with light, its bark glowing faintly in the starlight. The couple stood side by side, their fates intertwined beneath the vast, eternal sky. Chapter 8: Reflections on Ice. The days in the small village under the northern lights passed like a slow-moving river, carrying with them a rhythm unique to the isolated wilderness. But as the world around them moved in quiet predictability, Ingrid and Elias felt the stirrings of something extraordinary. Their paths, now intertwined, were not merely the crossing of two lives but the convergence of something far greater, a force neither of them could name yet felt deep in their bones. The first snowfall of December arrived that morning, blanketing the earth in a pristine layer of white. Ingrid stood at the window of her cabin, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snowflakes dance on the wind. The scene was one she had seen countless times, yet today it felt different, imbued with an unshakable sense of possibility. She wrapped herself in a thick woolen coat and stepped outside, the chill of the air biting her cheeks as the snow crunched underfoot. In the distance, the forest loomed, its trees draped in frost like sentinels guarding an ancient secret. Ingrid found herself drawn to the woods, her feet moving of their own accord. She didn't question the pull. It was as natural as breathing now. The forest had become her sanctuary, the place where she could hear the whispers of the universe if she listened closely enough. Elias, too, was drawn to the forest that day. He had spent the morning repairing the roof of his cabin, but a nagging feeling in his chest urged him to set aside his tools and follow the unspoken call. Slinging his leather satchel over his shoulder, he stepped into the snow-covered world, the air around him crisp and still. The lantern he carried cast a warm glow as he made his way through the trees, each step guided by an instinct he had long stopped questioning. The forest greeted him with its usual symphony, the creak of branches heavy with snow, the distant caw of a raven, and the faint rustle of wind through the evergreens. Yet there was something different today, a charge in the air that made his skin prickle. He pressed on, the path before him narrowing as the trees grew denser, their trunks black against the stark whiteness of the snow. Ingrid and Elias, though separated by distance, felt the same pull, as if the forest itself were orchestrating their movements. The threads of their lives, spun in the quiet moments of solitude and longing, were now weaving together in a pattern neither could see but both could feel. As the snow deepened and the light began to fade, their paths finally converged once more. In a small clearing, untouched by the footprints of man or beast, they found each other. Ingrid arrived first, her breath hitching as she stepped into the open space. The clearing was ringed by ancient trees, their branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the light into a soft, ethereal glow. At its center stood a single birch tree, its silver bark glinting like moonlight against the snow. Moments later, Elias emerged from the shadows, his figure outlined by the lantern's glow. Their eyes met across the clearing, and the connection between them felt as tangible as the snow beneath their feet. There were no words, no need for explanations or greetings. The forest had brought them here for a reason, and that was enough. Ingrid took a hesitant step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the snow. Elias mirrored her movement, the soft crunch of his steps blending with hers until they stood only a few feet apart. The birch tree stood between them, its silver bark smooth and unblemished, a silent witness to their meeting. Elias reached out first, his gloved hand brushing against the tree's surface. A faint warmth radiated from it, defying the biting cold of the air. Ingrid followed suit, her fingers tracing the same path as his, their movements synchronized as though guided by an unseen hand. The tree pulsed faintly beneath their touch, a rhythm that matched the steady beat of their hearts. The clearing seemed to hum with energy, the air around them alive with the resonance of something ancient and unnameable. The snowflakes that fell now sparkled like tiny stars, their descent slow and deliberate, as if they too were part of this moment. Ingrid closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her, and when she opened them again, she saw Elias watching her, his expression unreadable yet filled with a quiet intensity. Time lost meaning in that clearing, the minutes stretching into eternity as they stood together beneath the birch tree. Ingrid felt a peace she hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging she had long thought lost to the world. Elias, too, felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by the quiet certainty that he was no longer alone. The light began to shift as the day waned, the golden glow of afternoon giving way to the cool blues of twilight. Ingrid and Elias finally stepped back from the tree, their hands falling to their sides, but their connection unbroken. Without a word, they turned and began walking together, their steps in perfect harmony as they left the clearing behind. The forest seemed to sigh in their wake, its whispers growing softer as the night fell. Above them, the first stars of evening began to appear, their light faint but steady against the deepening sky. The northern lights, unseen yet ever-present, hovered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. As they walked, the silence between them was not an absence but a presence, filled with all the things they didn't need to say. Their paths, once separate and solitary, now moved as one, guided by the unseen threads of destiny that wove their lives into the tapestry of the universe. Chapter 9. Frozen Whispers. The days that followed were marked by an eerie stillness, a quietness that enveloped the village under the northern lights like a heavy, unspoken truth. Ingrid and Elias felt it more deeply now, the tension in the air as if the world were holding its breath. Something was coming, something neither of them could name, but it was as tangible as the cold bite of winter that had firmly settled into the land. The rhythm of their lives, once predictable and solitary, now beat to the same quiet pulse, a rhythm that seemed to grow in sync with their hearts. Each morning, Ingrid would step outside, her breath forming clouds in the cold, and gaze at the sky, waiting for the first hint of the northern lights to flicker in the distance. There was a part of her, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, that believed those lights held answers to questions she hadn't yet asked but already knew she would someday. But each day, the sky remained a canvas of pale blues and grays, the lights hidden, as though waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to unveil themselves. Elias, too, felt the pull of the sky. His days had been filled with solitary walks through the woods, his boots crunching through the snow, the quiet sound of nature around him like a lullaby. He had always been alone in his wanderings, content in his solitude, but now, his thoughts would often stray to Ingrid. He couldn't help it. The connection between them, though not yet spoken aloud, had grown stronger with every passing day. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more. A bond forged in the stillness of the landscape, in the shared moments that neither could fully explain. One evening, as twilight descended and the village prepared for the long, silent night, Ingrid made her way to the edge of the forest. The wind had picked up, its icy fingers brushing through the trees with a strange urgency. The air felt different, charged with energy. It was the kind of wind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, the kind that carried whispers from places far beyond the familiar landscape. She had learned to trust such winds in her time here. She had learned that they often carried messages hidden beneath their cold breath. As she ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around her, their dark silhouettes etched against the fading light. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the earth in a fresh layer of white. The silence of the woods was almost oppressive, the only sound the soft crunch of her boots on the snow. Ingrid could feel the pull of something, an unseen presence that seemed to guide her deeper into the heart of the forest. It was there, in the center of the woods, that she saw him. Elias stood beneath the towering pines, his silhouette just visible against the darkening sky. His presence was as much a part of the forest as the trees themselves, and for a moment, Ingrid wondered if he had been waiting for her. The wind howled through the trees, but neither of them flinched. It was as if the wind was not just a force of nature but something alive, something that knew their connection and whispered to them in a language they could almost understand. Their eyes met in the dimming light, and without a word, they began walking toward each other. The space between them seemed to shrink with each step, the world narrowing to the sound of their footsteps and the whisper of the wind. When they finally reached one another, Ingrid felt her heart skip a beat. It was the first time they had truly stood face to face like this, and though no words were spoken, the air between them felt electric. Elias took a slow, deliberate step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The wind shifted, swirling around them like a living thing, carrying with it a strange weight. Ingrid felt it too, the pull of something beyond the ordinary, something ancient that thrummed through the very earth beneath their feet. It was as if the forest itself had chosen this moment, this place, to weave their destinies together. And then, without a single word, Elias reached out and brushed his fingers against her hand, the touch gentle but full of meaning. The simple gesture was enough to send a shiver down Ingrid's spine. There was no need for words. They both understood. The connection between them had deepened, become something more than mere companionship or even friendship. It was something unspoken, a promise that hung in the air like the invisible threads of fate, binding them together in a way neither could explain. The wind quieted, as though satisfied with its task, and the world around them seemed to hold its breath once more. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, just the two of them beneath the ancient trees, the only sound the quiet rustle of the snow falling softly from the branches above. The northern lights had not yet revealed themselves, but Ingrid could feel them, just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to burst forth. "I've never felt anything like this," Elias said finally, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. Ingrid nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "Neither have I." They stood in the silence for what felt like hours, the moments stretched between them like a fragile thread. But the world, as it always did, began to shift again, as the last remnants of daylight disappeared into the night. Slowly, they turned and began walking back toward the village, their steps in sync, the wind now gentler around them. The night stretched before them, dark and endless. But for the first time in a long time, Ingrid felt something she hadn't known she was missing. It wasn't just the promise of the northern lights or the pull of the forest. It was something more, something she couldn't yet name but felt in the deepest corners of her heart. And in that moment, she knew that the winds of change were not something to fear. They were something to welcome. Chapter 10. In the heart of the blizzard. The days that followed seemed to stretch endlessly before Ingrid, like the long, cold nights of the north that would never quite let go of their grip. But with each passing day, she found herself drawn more and more to Elias, as though an invisible force was guiding her toward him. They shared an unspoken understanding, a silent connection that neither fully understood but both felt deeply. It wasn't the kind of love that came with grand gestures or declarations. It was a quiet, steady bond, one that neither could ignore. Elias, too, had become different in the days since their last encounter in the forest. He had been quieter, more contemplative, as though he had crossed some invisible threshold and was now standing on the precipice of something he couldn't yet name. When they were together, he seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It was as though he was waiting for something, something just out of reach, but he had no idea what it was or where it would come from. It was one late afternoon, as the pale light of the sun began to fade behind the horizon, that Ingrid found herself standing by the window of her cabin, staring out at the frozen landscape. The village was quiet, as it always was at this time of year. But there was something different about the stillness that day. The air was thick with expectation, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She had always been someone who relied on the quiet rhythms of nature to guide her, but now, those rhythms felt out of sync, as though the world around her was shifting in a way that she couldn't quite grasp. The northern lights had still not appeared, despite her hopes, and she had begun to wonder if they ever would. It wasn't that she didn't believe in them. They were part of the very essence of this place, woven into its stories and legends. But there was something about the lights that felt different now, as though they were no longer just a natural phenomenon but something far greater, something that could only be understood when the time was right. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Elias. She hadn't been expecting him, but a part of her had always known he would come. There was no explaining it, no rationalizing the feeling that had settled deep within her heart. She crossed the room quickly, her boots making a soft thud against the wooden floor, and opened the door to find him standing on the other side, his breath visible in the cold air. "Good evening," Elias said, his voice low but steady, as if speaking louder would somehow disrupt the fragile peace that had settled between them. Ingrid smiled, her heart warmed despite the chill that lingered in the air. "Good evening, Elias. What brings you here?" "I came to check on you," he said simply, "to see how you're doing." There was a long pause, a silence that felt comfortable, even though neither of them had said anything particularly meaningful. Ingrid stepped aside to let him in, and he moved into the warmth of the cabin, shedding his coat and hanging it by the door. The cabin was small, simple, and cozy. Just a few pieces of furniture, a small fire crackling in the hearth, and the ever-present scent of pine that seemed to cling to everything. But it was enough. It was a place of quiet, of peace, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. "I've been thinking," Elias said after a moment, his gaze distant, as if lost in thought, "about the northern lights. About why they haven't appeared yet." Ingrid's heart skipped a beat, and she turned toward him. "You've been thinking about them too?" He nodded slowly. "I don't know why, but it feels like they're not just a natural occurrence anymore. It's almost as if they're waiting for something, something that hasn't happened yet." Ingrid swallowed hard, a shiver running down her spine. She had been thinking the same thing, but she had never voiced it aloud. There was something about the lights, something beyond their beauty, something she couldn't quite put into words. But hearing Elias speak of it, her suspicions were confirmed. "I felt it too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's like they're tied to something, something we don't fully understand." Elias turned toward her, his eyes dark with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "And what if they're tied to us?" he asked, his voice almost incredulous. "What if everything that's been happening, the quiet, the waiting, has been leading up to something, leading up to us?" Ingrid felt a rush of emotions flood through her. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could even form the words. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The silence between them was full of understanding, of something unspoken but undeniable. She could see it in his eyes, and she knew he could see it in hers. They stood there, in the quiet of the cabin, with the warmth of the fire crackling in the background, and for a long time, neither of them moved. There was no need to. Everything they needed to say had already been said, in the unspoken moments that had passed between them, in the way they looked at each other when no one was watching. The northern lights were still just a distant dream, still hidden behind the horizon, but Ingrid knew, deep in her soul, that they were coming. And when they arrived, they would not just light up the sky. They would light up everything, revealing the truth of what had always been between her and Elias, what had been building quietly and steadily, like the snow that blanketed the ground outside. There was a promise in the air now, a silent understanding that what had begun in the quiet of the forest, in the space between breaths and stolen glances, was only the beginning of something far greater. The northern lights would come when they were ready, but in the meantime, Ingrid and Elias had each other. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 11. A Night Without Stars. The days seemed to blur into one another as the northern lights still held their distance. There were moments when Ingrid thought she glimpsed them just on the edge of her vision, but whenever she turned to look, they were gone, like a fleeting memory slipping through her fingers. Elias had become a constant presence in her life, a shadow at her side, not in an oppressive way but in the softest, most comforting manner. His presence was like the calm before the storm, soothing her heart while heightening the anticipation of what was to come. They spent hours together, walking the narrow trails that wove through the snow-covered trees, or sitting beside the fire, sharing stories of places they had been and dreams they had yet to fulfill. There was a silence that always seemed to fall between them in these moments, not uncomfortable, but profound. Neither of them had the need for words. They had learned to understand each other through the smallest gestures, the smallest looks that seemed to speak volumes. But even as they grew closer, Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something just beyond reach. One evening, when the light was fading and the temperature had dropped, Elias stood by the cabin window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Ingrid watched him from the corner of the room, her heart tight with something she couldn't name. He had become more withdrawn in the past few days, his mind clearly occupied with something that he couldn't yet share. There was a restlessness about him, an energy in the air around him that made the space between them feel heavy. "Do you ever feel like something is about to change?" Elias asked, his voice low, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. Ingrid turned to face him fully, her heart skipping a beat at the vulnerability in his words. She had been feeling the same way, a quiet tension building beneath the surface of everything. "Yes," she replied softly, "I feel it too, like something is about to happen, something big, but I don't know what it is." Elias turned away from the window, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes were dark with an intensity that seemed to reflect the stillness of the world around them. "It's like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I don't know how much longer I can wait." Ingrid's heart clenched at his words, but she said nothing. What could she say? She understood what he was feeling, perhaps more than she wanted to admit. The northern lights had become a symbol, not just of beauty, but of something deeper, something more elusive. The lights were tied to something inside her, something inside them both, and yet they remained just out of reach, like a dream that never quite materialized. The quiet was broken by the sound of a soft knock at the door. Ingrid turned, surprised to see that anyone would be out here in the cold at this hour. She moved to the door, opening it to reveal a familiar figure standing in the snow, a figure she hadn't seen in days. It was Samuel, the man who had been a part of the village for as long as anyone could remember. He was an enigma, someone who lived on the fringes of the town, rarely seen except for when the weather grew harsh or when something needed fixing. He had always been kind to Ingrid, but there was something about him that made her uneasy. His eyes always seemed to hold a secret, a quiet sadness that he kept hidden behind his calm demeanor. "Evening," Samuel greeted, his voice steady and warm despite the cold that surrounded him. "I hope I'm not disturbing anything." Ingrid shook her head, stepping aside to let him in. "Not at all, Samuel. What brings you here?" He glanced at Elias, who was now standing a few feet away, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "I need to speak to both of you," Samuel said, his tone more serious now, as though something had shifted in him. "There's something you need to know." Ingrid's stomach tightened, a sense of foreboding creeping up her spine. She turned to Elias, who looked equally puzzled, but nodded for Samuel to continue. "The Northern Lights," Samuel began, his voice lowering as if to make sure no one else could hear. "They're not just a natural phenomenon. They're tied to something older, something that has been here long before any of us. And if you're waiting for them to appear, you should know this. When they come, everything will change." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, thick and heavy, making it hard for Ingrid to breathe. Elias stepped closer to Samuel, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? You're saying the lights aren't just lights?" Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving theirs. "The lights are the heralds of a change. They appear when someone, is about to enter a new phase. It's an awakening, a transformation, but it comes with consequences. You both feel it, don't you? The pull, the need to understand, to be closer to the lights." Ingrid swallowed hard, her mind racing to catch up with what Samuel was saying. Elias was silent, his gaze distant as though he were trying to process the weight of Samuel's words. "You're saying they've come for us?" Ingrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel gave a small nod, his face somber. "Not just you two. All of us, in a way. But you, especially. The two of you are tied to the lights in a way that goes beyond anything you can understand right now. When they finally appear, they will reveal everything. The past, the present, the future. And you will have to make a choice." A heavy silence fell over the room, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the stillness. Ingrid's mind was spinning, caught between the growing tension of Samuel's words and the undeniable pull she felt toward Elias. What was this choice? What would happen when the lights finally appeared? "I don't know what's coming," Samuel said, his voice now low, almost resigned. "But I can tell you this. When it happens, it will change everything." With that, Samuel turned and left as quietly as he had come, leaving Ingrid and Elias standing in the center of the cabin, the weight of his words settling over them like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Ingrid felt her pulse quicken, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Elias, searching his face for any sign of understanding, but all she found was the same confusion and anticipation that mirrored her own. They didn't know what was coming, but one thing was certain. They couldn't turn back now. The Northern Lights were coming, and when they did, everything would change. Chapter 12. The Dance of Fire and Frost. The next few days passed with an eerie calm, like the last moments before a storm. The snow kept falling, and the Northern Lights still eluded Ingrid and Elias, just beyond their grasp. But the weight of Samuel's words pressed heavily on both of them. The pull toward the unknown seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. It was as if something ancient and unseen was calling them, urging them to prepare, to be ready for whatever was about to unfold. The silence between them deepened. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of things left unsaid. Ingrid spent hours walking alone in the snow-covered woods, trying to make sense of the strange pull she felt deep inside her, a pull that grew stronger as the days went on. There were moments when she felt as though she were being watched, the feeling of unseen eyes following her every step. Yet when she turned, no one was there. It was the kind of feeling that gnawed at the back of your mind, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Elias, too, seemed distant. He spent long hours outside, walking through the snow-covered landscape, lost in his own thoughts. He wasn't the type to share his feelings openly, but Ingrid could sense the change in him. His eyes held a darkness now, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. He wasn't the man she had first met in the village. There was something new about him, something that made her both yearn for and fear what was to come. One night, After a particularly quiet dinner, Elias turned to her, his face more serious than she had ever seen it. "Ingrid," he said, his voice low, "I can't shake the feeling that we're running out of time. Something's coming, and we have to be ready." She nodded, her heart racing. She had felt it too, that same sense of urgency creeping into her bones. But what could they do? The Northern Lights, the change that Samuel had spoken of, how could they prepare for something so beyond their understanding? "I know," she whispered, unable to hide the fear in her voice. "But what if we're not ready? What if we don't know what we're supposed to do?" Elias's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to her. His hand reached out to gently touch hers, a reassuring gesture that somehow didn't ease the fear that had settled in her chest. "We don't have to understand everything right now. All we can do is face it together. Whatever happens, we face it together." Ingrid held his gaze, his words wrapping around her like a lifeline, though the storm of uncertainty raged within her. Together. She wanted to believe in that, wanted to believe that no matter what came, they would be able to face it side by side. But even as she stood there, her heart pounding, there was a nagging sense that Elias was keeping something from her, a secret buried deep inside him that he wasn't yet ready to share. She didn't press him for answers, not yet. It wasn't the right time. The next morning, the air had a sharpness to it that felt different from the usual winter chill. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something beyond their control. As she stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the endless stretch of snow, she caught sight of something strange. In the distance, near the tree line, there was a figure, a silhouette standing still in the snow, as though waiting for something. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her, but as she blinked and focused, the figure remained. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it Samuel? No, it couldn't be. He hadn't been this far out in the woods before, and there was something unsettling about the way the figure stood, motionless, staring at the horizon. Without thinking, Ingrid grabbed her coat and ran out into the snow, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. The cold bit at her face, but she barely felt it as she made her way toward the figure. When she got closer, her breath caught in her throat. The figure hadn't moved. It stood there, still as death, its back to her. She could see nothing of its face, but there was something familiar about the posture, the way the shoulders seemed to sag, as if the weight of the world rested on them. "Ingrid," a voice called softly, and she froze in place, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. It wasn't Elias's voice. It wasn't Samuel's either. The figure slowly turned, and Ingrid's heart stopped. The face before her was familiar, but not in the way she expected. It was her own reflection, distorted, as though it had been stretched and twisted by something dark. The eyes, the same shade of green as hers, were empty, hollow. There was no warmth, no light in them, just an infinite void. She gasped, stepping back, her breath coming in sharp bursts as panic flooded her chest. What was this? How could this be? The figure, the reflection of herself, did not speak. It only stood there, watching her, as though it was waiting for her to do something, waiting for her to understand. She reached out instinctively, but as her fingers brushed the cold air, the figure vanished, fading into the swirling snow like a ghost, leaving nothing behind but the growing darkness in the sky. Ingrid stumbled back, her mind reeling from what she had just seen. Was she losing her mind? Had the isolation of this place started to take its toll on her? Elias appeared behind her, his face etched with concern. He had clearly seen her reaction. "Ingrid, what is it? What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. Ingrid turned to him, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain what she had just witnessed? How could she explain the reflection of herself, standing there in the snow, waiting. I saw something," she said, her voice trembling. "It was me, Elias. But it wasn't me. I don't know what it was. I'm not sure if I'm even seeing things clearly anymore." Elias's hand reached out to touch her arm, his grip firm, grounding her in that moment. "You're not alone in this, Ingrid. We'll figure this out together." But Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping further out of reach. The figure, was it a warning? A vision of what was to come? Whatever it was, she knew that they were no longer just waiting for the northern lights. They were waiting for something far more dangerous, something that was coming for them, and the consequences would be far greater than either of them could imagine. Chapter 13. Hollowed Peaks. The days grew colder, the nights longer, and the tension between Ingrid and Elias only seemed to deepen with each passing hour. The incident in the woods had left a lingering shadow over their relationship. Elias had been distant ever since, lost in his own thoughts, rarely speaking of what happened, and Ingrid, too, was consumed by the mysterious vision of herself in the snow. She couldn't explain it, couldn't begin to understand what it meant or why it had happened. But every time she closed her eyes, she could see the hollow gaze of that reflection, as if it were calling to her, urging her to uncover some hidden truth. Elias had suggested that they go into the village the next day to seek out Samuel. He'd been quiet on the matter for a while, but now he seemed determined to learn more about the cryptic warnings Samuel had offered before they had come here. Ingrid had no objections. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening to them, why the northern lights seemed to be drawing them in, and why their world felt so wrong now, as if the air around them was heavy with something unseen, waiting. The journey to the village was long and silent. Elias drove the old truck through the thickening snow, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, his jaw set in determination. Ingrid sat beside him, her gaze drifting out the window, watching the swirling white flakes dance in the air. It was beautiful in a way, but it was also suffocating. Everything felt like it was closing in on them, pushing them towards something neither of them was ready to face. The village was a stark contrast to the isolation of the cabin. It felt warmer, in a way, though the air was just as cold. The buildings huddled together like a family, offering the kind of protection that Ingrid had come to appreciate in the weeks she had spent in the wilderness. It was strange, though, how familiar everything seemed, yet how foreign it felt to her now. She had been to the village before, of course, but today it felt different. It was as if time had slowed down here, or maybe it had sped up. It was hard to tell. The whole world felt off-kilter. Samuel's cabin was nestled at the edge of the village, just beyond the tree line. It was old and weathered, the wooden beams gray with age, but there was something inviting about it, something that made Ingrid feel as though she could breathe again. As they approached, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had been here 100 times before, though she knew that wasn't possible. Perhaps it was just the weight of everything that had happened recently pressing on her. Elias parked the truck and glanced at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since they had left the cabin, and Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. It wasn't just the vision she had seen, or the tension that hung in the air. It was something deeper, something that she couldn't name. "I'll talk to him," Elias said, his voice low and steady, breaking the silence. "Stay here, okay? It might be better if you don't get involved in this just yet." Ingrid frowned, but she said nothing. She didn't know why Elias wanted to keep her out of this conversation. Maybe it was because he still hadn't fully explained his own thoughts about what was happening, about the dangers they were facing. But she wasn't the type to just wait around. Not anymore. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm, even though doubt crept into her chest. Elias hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There was no arguing with Ingrid once she had made up her mind. The two of them walked up to the cabin together, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound breaking the silence. The door creaked as they entered, and Samuel looked up from a desk cluttered with papers and old books. He was sitting in the same worn armchair that Ingrid remembered from their last visit, the fire in the hearth crackling softly beside him. The room smelled of pine and something earthy, a scent that seemed to settle in Ingrid's lungs like a forgotten memory. Samuel's gaze flicked over to them, his eyes narrowing as though he had been expecting them. He didn't greet them with a smile, but then again, he hadn't been one for pleasantries. Instead, his eyes went directly to Ingrid, as if seeing her for the first time. And then he nodded, acknowledging Elias. "I knew you'd come back," Samuel said, his voice low and gravelly. "It was only a matter of time." Ingrid shivered at the way he spoke, as if he knew something they didn't. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the walls themselves were pressing in, urging them to ask the questions they had been avoiding for so long. Elias stepped forward, his posture tense, and without any preamble, asked, "What's happening, Samuel? Why are the northern lights calling to us? Why is everything wrong?" Samuel's eyes flickered toward Ingrid for a brief moment before he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He was an old man, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made him seem ageless, as though time had little hold on him. "The northern lights are not just a natural phenomenon," Samuel began, his voice taking on a deeper tone. "They are a bridge to something beyond this world, something ancient, something that has been waiting for centuries. You two, you're not just here by chance. You're being chosen." Ingrid's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a coldness creep over her skin. Chosen? What did he mean? Was this about her vision, the reflection she had seen in the woods? Was this about Elias, too, the way he had changed in the last few weeks? Chosen for what? Elias asked, his voice tight with urgency. Samuel met his gaze with an unreadable expression, then spoke in a tone that made Ingrid's blood run cold. "You're both connected to something ancient, a force that is coming for you, and for the rest of the world. The northern lights are a sign, a warning, but also an invitation." Ingrid felt her knees weaken, the ground beneath her suddenly feeling unsteady, as if the world was shifting. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel's gaze shifted to the window, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the snowstorm that raged outside. "It means you are the key," he said, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "You, Ingrid. You, Elias. Together, you must choose. You must decide if you're ready to face what is coming, or if you will let it consume you." The words hung heavy in the air, each one more suffocating than the last. Ingrid could feel a knot form in her stomach as the weight of Samuel's words settled over her like a storm. The northern lights, the reflections, the strange occurrences, it was all leading to this moment. But what could they do? How could they stop what was coming? Chapter 14. Where the sky touches the earth. The wind howled against the cabin, a fierce, biting force that seemed to echo the chaos swirling inside Ingrid's mind. Every word Samuel had spoken clung to her, dragging her thoughts into places she was too afraid to go. The northern lights were not merely a cosmic event. They were something ancient, something waiting, and she and Elias, bound together by fate, were at the heart of it all. As the silence settled between them, Samuel's words weighed on them like an invisible chain, dragging them down. The fire in the hearth crackled loudly, the only sound in the otherwise still room. Ingrid's chest tightened, and her throat felt dry. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the terror of the unknown held her back, as if fear itself had settled in the very air they breathed. Elias stood across from Samuel, his expression unreadable. His hands were clenched at his sides, fingers white from the pressure. His gaze never left Samuel, but there was something in his eyes, something Ingrid hadn't seen before, a flicker of fear. He was afraid of what they might learn, or perhaps of what Samuel already knew. Ingrid shifted uncomfortably, her eyes drifting between the two men. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to hear what Samuel had to say next, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing urge to know more, to understand what was coming, even if it meant facing something beyond her comprehension. The decision was upon them, whether they were ready or not. "What do you mean by you must choose?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain, but laced with an intensity that surprised even her. Samuel's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Ingrid could have sworn she saw the flicker of something darker pass over his face, something ancient and cruel. The way he spoke next was slow, deliberate, as if weighing each word carefully before releasing it into the air. "The lights are not just a bridge," he continued, his voice lowering to almost a whisper, "but a path that leads to what is waiting beneath the earth, beneath the sky, and within each of you. It has been waiting for centuries, watching, waiting for the right moment to break free." The hairs on the back of Ingrid's neck stood on end. She felt an unnatural chill crawl down her spine, as though the very atmosphere had shifted. She glanced at Elias, searching for some semblance of understanding in his eyes, but he was as still as stone, lost in the gravity of the words Samuel had just spoken. "Is this what we've been feeling?" she asked, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. "Is this what we were meant for?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, where the storm raged outside, the snow swirling in violent gusts. His eyes seemed to pierce through the wall, as if he were seeing something far beyond the present moment. Then, slowly, he spoke again, his words carrying a weight that seemed to press against Ingrid's chest. "The northern lights are a sign of the beginning," Samuel said, his voice low and ominous. "And you, Ingrid, you have felt it, the pull, the call. It is a force you cannot ignore, no matter how much you want to. You are part of something far greater than yourself." Ingrid felt the weight of his words settle deep within her. She couldn't deny it. The pull, the strange sensation that had been growing ever stronger in the past weeks, like a whisper in her ear, like an ache in her bones. It had been building since the moment they had arrived here, beneath the light of the shimmering auroras. The lights called to her, beckoned her closer, as if they knew her name. "But why us?" she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. "Why us, Samuel?" He turned back to face her, his expression grave. "Because you are bound by blood and fate. You and Elias share a connection that goes beyond this lifetime, beyond this world. And the time has come for you to choose, to confront what's waiting or to let it claim you." Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee, to run far away from all of this. But where could she go? The pull of the lights was too strong. It was in her blood, in her soul. The truth was becoming undeniable, even if she wished she could turn away from it. Elias spoke then, his voice hoarse, as though he, too, had been struck by the gravity of the revelation. "And if we don't choose, what happens then?" Samuel's face grew darker, and his gaze shifted from Elias to Ingrid, a look that made Ingrid's heart race. "Then it will make the choice for you," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of impending doom. The air in the room grew colder, the fire in the hearth flickering weakly as if responding to the ominous presence in the cabin. Ingrid felt the temperature drop in her chest, as though the icy grip of something ancient had found its way inside her, wrapping around her heart, squeezing it tightly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, there was a stillness, a tension that hung thick in the air, as if time itself had paused. Ingrid's thoughts whirled, the weight of everything pressing against her mind. The lights, the visions, the strange sense of déjà vu. It was all converging, like a dark wave rising on the horizon, ready to crash. "I need time," Ingrid whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay strong. "I need time to think." Elias finally turned to her, his face softer now, though his eyes still carried that same haunted look. He nodded, his jaw tight. "We all do," he said, "but time is running out." Samuel watched them both, his gaze lingering, as though he could see something beyond their words, beyond their fear. Then, without another word, he turned toward the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence stretched between them like a bridge, a chasm of uncertainty and dread. "I suggest you prepare yourselves," Samuel said quietly. "The choice will come whether you're ready or not, and the northern lights will not wait forever." Ingrid felt the full weight of his words settle over her, and for the first time since they had arrived, she realized the depth of what they were facing. The northern lights were not just a spectacle in the sky. They were a doorway, a beckoning force that would not be denied. And no matter what they chose, the consequences would be irreversible. Chapter 15. Breaking the Frozen Veil. The air inside the cabin felt thicker now, as if the very walls were closing in on them. The storm outside had begun to subside, but the tension inside was palpable, hanging over them like a storm cloud of its own. Ingrid could feel the weight of Samuel's words pressing down on her, and no matter how much she tried to push them away, they kept coming back. The choice. The inevitable, terrifying choice that would either save them or destroy them. Elias sat at the far end of the room, his face cast in shadows by the flickering firelight. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles pale from the strain. Ingrid couldn't help but feel the distance between them, even though they sat only a few feet apart. It was as though something invisible had risen up between them, something unspoken and unseeable but undeniable. A wall had formed, and it felt as though it was growing taller by the second. She wanted to reach for him, to close the gap between them, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, trapped by her own fear, her own uncertainty. The northern lights, the way they pulsed in the sky like living, breathing entities. They were a call, and the pull was only getting stronger. Every moment that passed, she felt herself being drawn closer to them, as though they were waiting for her, just beyond the reach of her understanding. "What are we supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the flames, his eyes dark and distant. Ingrid's heart ached for him. She knew he was just as torn, just as trapped by the enormity of the decision that lay before them. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice rough, as though speaking the words was an effort. "But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we choose, it won't be the end. It'll only be the beginning." Ingrid nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking deep into her. She had felt it too. The sense that this wasn't just some mystical occurrence, some strange happenstance brought on by the northern lights. It was something far deeper, something older and far more dangerous. The lights were not a gift. They were a test, a trial that would shape the course of their lives forever, or perhaps end them entirely. Samuel had warned them of the consequences, of the cost of the choices they would have to make. But he hadn't told them everything. He hadn't told them what would happen if they refused to choose, if they tried to walk away from it all. Ingrid had a feeling that the consequences of inaction would be far worse than anything they could imagine. She looked up at the sky through the small window in the cabin, her heart racing. The northern lights were dancing there, more brilliant than she had ever seen them before. They shimmered in the sky like the fingers of some invisible hand, reaching down to claim what was rightfully theirs. Ingrid could feel their power in the pit of her stomach, like a thrum of electricity running through her veins. It was an undeniable force, pulling her closer, closer to the unknown, to the waiting darkness beneath the beauty of the auroras. "I think we need to go," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to suggest. Elias turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like forever. His gaze was filled with something raw and vulnerable that made Ingrid's heart skip a beat. She could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite name. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. "We need to go to them," Ingrid said, her words coming out in a rush. "We need to face whatever it is that's calling us. We can't run anymore." Elias stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He paced across the room, his hands running through his hair in agitation. "And if it's too late?" he asked, his voice strained. "What if we've already made a choice without even knowing it? What if—" "We haven't," Ingrid interrupted, her voice firm, even though her insides were shaking. "It's not too late. We still have time. But we need to act now. We need to go to the lights." There was a long, agonizing silence between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Elias seemed to be weighing her words, considering the consequences of what she was suggesting. Ingrid could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between the man he was and the man he could be, the man she hoped he would be. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "If we're going, we do it together. No matter what happens." Ingrid felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. She didn't know what awaited them out there, beneath the shifting colors of the northern lights, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. And that, at least, gave her the strength to take the next step. "We'll go," she said softly. "Together." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as the two of them gathered their things in silence. Ingrid packed only the essentials, her coat, her gloves, a scarf, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the path ahead. She could feel the pull of the lights growing stronger, could feel the ground beneath her feet trembling with the promise of what was to come. When they stepped outside, the air was bitterly cold, but the sky was clear, the northern lights more brilliant than ever. They swirled above them in a mesmerizing dance of colors, like living waves of light and shadow. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked into the open, the world around them holding its breath. Elias took her hand, his fingers tight around hers, and together they walked toward the lights, knowing that their destiny awaited them. As they approached the edge of the forest, the sky seemed to pulse in time with their steps, as though the very heavens were alive, watching them, guiding them. Ingrid's heart raced in her chest as they reached the clearing, the auroras above them casting a strange, ethereal glow on the world around them. There was no turning back now. They stood together, side by side, beneath the shimmering lights, and Ingrid knew. Whatever was coming, whatever they had to face, it was already here. The choice had been made, and all that was left was to confront it. The darkness that had been waiting, patient and still, would no longer wait. It was time for them to face what had been calling them all along. Chapter 16. The Promise in the Glow. The light from the northern lights seemed to be closing in on them, narrowing their world to the soft glow that pulsed above. Ingrid stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, each exhale mixing with the cold air and floating upward in delicate tendrils. Elias stood beside her, his grip on her hand firm and unyielding, grounding her to the moment, to this place where the air seemed to hum with anticipation. Every part of her felt electrified, as though the very atmosphere was charged with some ancient power. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself amidst the rush of emotions that cascaded over her. There had been fear, yes, deep-rooted and persistent, but there had also been something else, something like hope, or perhaps resignation. She had long known that there was no turning back, but now, standing beneath the lights, she could feel the weight of what it all meant. It was not simply a choice of whether to face the unknown. It was a choice of who they would become, a choice that would redefine them, not just as individuals, but as something larger than themselves. She opened her eyes again, the vibrant colors of the lights reflecting in her gaze. The northern lights, so beautiful and strange, now felt like a living thing, an entity that pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to speak directly to her soul. She knew, without a doubt, that the lights were more than just an atmospheric phenomenon. They were a presence, a force, and they were waiting for something, waiting for them. "There's no turning back now," Elias said quietly, though his voice was almost drowned out by the wind. His words were not a question, nor were they a statement of resignation. There was something about his tone that made Ingrid feel as though the truth of what was happening was finally sinking into both of them. "I know," she replied, her voice steady even as her heart raced. She squeezed his hand, her fingers tight around his. This was it. This was the moment that everything had been leading to, the culmination of all their choices, all their fears and hopes. The snow around them had stopped falling, and the landscape had become eerily still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Even the wind had quieted, leaving only the faint hum of the auroras above them. The air was so still that it seemed to hum with energy, like the calm before an explosion. They stood there for a long time, unsure of what came next, the silence between them heavy and thick with meaning. Then, a sudden shift, a subtle change in the air that made Ingrid's skin prickle. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble ever so slightly, a low vibration that could be felt more than heard. She looked around, her eyes scanning the clearing, but there was nothing visible, nothing tangible, but there was something. She could feel it. The lights above seemed to flicker, as if responding to her unease. Then, they began to spiral faster, their colors deepening. Brilliant greens, intense purples, bright blues, all swirling in a tempest of light. They seemed to be pulling inward, collapsing upon themselves, as if seeking something, as if calling to her. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She could feel a pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward the center of the clearing. The lights beckoned her like a hand reaching out from the void. Without thinking, her body began to move, stepping forward, her feet carrying her toward the heart of the storm of light. Elias pulled her back abruptly, his hand firm around her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse with the urgency of the moment. "Don't go toward it. There's something wrong." But Ingrid, now barely able to think beyond the overwhelming presence of the lights, couldn't stop herself. She looked up at him, but his face was distant, blurry, as though the world around them was beginning to warp. Her mind felt clouded, and all she could hear was the hum, the thrum of the lights, deep and resonant, vibrating in her chest, in her soul. I have to go," she murmured, her voice distant even to her own ears. She felt herself drawn forward, like an iron filing to a magnet, unable to resist. Elias gripped her tighter, his fingers digging into her arm with force, pulling her back. "Ingrid," he shouted. But his voice was a muffled echo, swallowed by the oppressive presence of the lights. "Don't let it take you." For a moment, everything seemed to blur together, and Ingrid felt the world spin, her mind screaming for clarity, but the lights. No, the energy, the force, was overwhelming. It was as if it had a consciousness, a will of its own, and it wanted her. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, and suddenly, everything around her was swallowed by a blinding light. The very air crackled, vibrating with power, and Ingrid could feel the world slipping away from her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no room for fear. Only the undeniable certainty that something was about to happen, something they could not stop, no matter how hard they tried. Then, in an instant, the world went silent. No wind, no light, no sound. Ingrid found herself standing in the center of the clearing, the lights above her frozen in time, suspended in midair like a still photograph. She looked around, her pulse racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't see Elias. She couldn't hear anything. The world had gone still, unnaturally still, as though time itself had stopped. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the frozen world, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life, only the eerie glow of the northern lights above her, shining down like 1,000 eyes, watching her. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably there, whispered in her ear, as though carried on the wind. "You have come. Now, the choice is yours." Ingrid froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The voice was not Elias's, nor Samuel's, nor anyone she recognized. It was a voice from somewhere beyond, somewhere deep inside her, or perhaps from the very heart of the Auroras themselves. The air shifted, swirling around her like a vortex, and she felt the weight of the choice bearing down on her. She had come this far, and now there was no going back. The future was suspended in front of her, her fate hanging by a single thread. The voice spoke again, this time louder, clearer. "Will you claim the power, or will you let it slip away?" Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to choose. How could she? The world around her seemed to pulse with energy, the northern lights swirling in every direction, as if waiting for her answer. And, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the world rushed back into motion. The lights above flared brighter, a blinding explosion of color. The wind kicked up again, howling in a frenzy, and the earth beneath Ingrid's feet trembled as though the very world was coming alive. She felt a pull, not toward the lights, but toward Elias, toward the promise of something real, something she could touch, something she could hold on to. "Choose now," the voice urged, a command wrapped in a question. Ingrid reached out for Elias, her heart screaming for him to be there. "Elias!" she cried, but the wind swallowed her words. She turned in desperation, but the choice had already been made. With no other path before her, Ingrid stepped into the light, letting the unknown envelop her completely. Chapter 17. A World Awakened. The light that had consumed Ingrid felt like it was inside her, around her, a warmth and coldness intertwining into one. She could not tell where her body ended and the force of the auroras began. Her mind reeled with the sensation of being unmoored from time and space. Yet in that deep disorientation, there was a sense of clarity, a sharpness that cut through the fog of confusion. It was as though she were seeing the world for the first time. Her senses heightened to a degree that felt almost alien. She had stepped into the light, and now it was stepping into her. The world that she had once known felt so distant, so small. She could see it, but it was like a dream fading from memory, an echo of a place that had once existed. The frozen world around her had disappeared, the clearing now nothing more than a whisper in the wind. The northern lights had become a vast sea of color, a canvas that stretched endlessly in every direction, pulling her deeper into its fold. But amid this overwhelming spectacle, there was something else, something darker. A whisper, distant but unmistakable, echoed in her ears. It was the same voice she had heard earlier, the one that had guided her to this point, but now it felt colder, more insistent. "Not yet," the voice whispered, and Ingrid could feel its breath against her skin. "You have not chosen. You must still choose." She felt the ground beneath her shift, like a deep groan of the earth itself, pulling her down into its core. But there was no real danger, no fear. The sensation was more like being drawn into a story where the plot had already been written, and her place in it was yet to be revealed. Suddenly, the sensation broke. The light around her burst into 1,000 fragments, scattering in all directions. Ingrid found herself falling, tumbling through the air as the cold wind rushed past her. The earth rose to meet her, but she didn't know if she would land. Her breath caught in her throat as the moment stretched, the world turning upside down. She couldn't make sense of where she was, but something inside her knew she was close. Closer than she had ever been. With a thud, she landed on the soft, snow-covered ground. It was the softest landing she could have hoped for, yet it felt as though her body had been crushed by the weight of the world. She gasped for air, her lungs aching, her chest tight. The harsh, cold wind bit at her exposed skin, but still, she could not pull herself away from the overwhelming sensation that something profound had happened. Slowly, she forced herself to sit up, her hands pressed against the snow, grounding herself as she looked around. The clearing was different now. The familiar landscape was replaced by an unfamiliar world, one where the trees stood as tall, skeletal silhouettes, their branches twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. The sky above was a deep shade of purple, the northern lights still swirling across it, but this time they had lost their warmth. There was no gentle, soothing glow, only a fierce, electric current, like a pulse of energy that ran through the very air itself. But that voice, was silent now. The presence that had once guided her was gone, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. The absence felt like a void, a space where something crucial had been lost. She had entered into something far beyond herself, and now, standing in this strange new reality, she wasn't sure if she could return to what she had known. A soft shuffle behind her caught her attention. Ingrid spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. No figure, no presence. Only the shadow of a figure in the distance, faint and blurry, barely perceptible. But she could feel it. The sensation of being watched, the feeling of someone or something just out of reach, just beyond her understanding. She stood, her legs shaking beneath her, the energy of the moment still swirling in her veins. But as she took a hesitant step forward, the ground seemed to shift again, the space around her warping like ripples on a pond. Her vision blurred for a moment, the world twisting and distorting. When the world steadied again, she was no longer alone. Elias was there, standing before her, his figure faint at first, like a shadow trying to manifest itself in the light. He was as she remembered, tall, his face drawn in concentration, but his eyes were wide, filled with something that bordered between confusion and recognition. "Ingrid," he said, though the words were not truly spoken. She felt them inside her, like a silent plea that reverberated through her chest. Her heart skipped, and for a moment, she wanted to reach out to him, to run to him and hold him, to restore the world they once knew. But as her hand moved toward him, the figure shifted, flickering like a broken image on an old television screen. The world around her seemed to rip apart, the lines between reality and the strange new world blurring into something unrecognizable. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "What is happening? Where are we?" Elias's form shimmered again, his image flickering like a dying light bulb. It was as though he were not truly there, but a reflection of her memory, a phantom of a past that could never be reclaimed. She reached for him again, her body moving with urgency, but when her fingers brushed against his outstretched hand, he disappeared entirely. The cold winds howled around her, and she stumbled back, panic rising in her chest. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, and the world seemed to close in on her, as if the very air was compressing, squeezing her breath from her lungs. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The world settled once more into its eerie silence. the ground beneath her feet solid, the trees still and unmoving. But Ingrid knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world around her had changed, and she had crossed into something more dangerous, more uncertain than she had ever imagined. She didn't know how to return. She didn't know if it was even possible. But one thing was clear. Elias was here, in some form, somewhere, just beyond reach. She could feel his presence, and no matter how far apart they seemed to be, she could never give up. The voice spoke again, this time from inside her, resonating deep within her soul. The end is only a beginning, Ingrid. The heart of the storm is within you. The path forward is yours to choose. And so, with the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had seen, Ingrid took a deep breath, knowing that this journey had only just begun. Chapter 18. Under the Eternal Light. The dawn was a whisper at first, a soft light creeping over the horizon, as though the world was holding its breath. Ingrid stood in the middle of the clearing, her body tired but her heart alert, thrumming with an energy that could not be contained. The snow beneath her feet, once a blank canvas, now seemed to glow with a pale, ethereal light, reflecting the changing sky above. It was as if the world itself was waking up, stretching from a long, restless slumber. The northern lights, which had once filled the night with their electric energy, were now fading, their colors softening into hues of lavender and gold, dissipating like smoke in the morning air. The silence that hung around her was no longer oppressive. Instead, it felt like a promise, a space between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Ingrid could feel it in her bones, the knowledge that something had shifted within her. The events that had brought her here, to this moment, were still fresh in her mind. The light, the pull of the auroras, Elias's phantom presence. It was all part of a story she had never expected to write, yet it had unfolded before her with a certainty she couldn't deny. What she had learned, what she had seen, had left its mark on her, shaping the person she was becoming. But now, as the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, she felt something else, a sense of possibility, an opening that had not been there before. She had chosen. It was a choice she had made in the deepest recesses of her heart, a choice that transcended the chaos, the confusion, and the fear that had once threatened to swallow her whole. The path she had walked had been one of discovery, of learning to trust in herself, in the world around her, and in the connections that had pulled her forward. The road had not been easy, but it had been necessary. The light, the darkness, they had both shaped her. But now, standing at the threshold of this new dawn, she knew that neither would define her future. As the sun rose higher, Ingrid began to walk forward, her feet crunching in the snow as she moved toward the edge of the clearing. Her breath, once visible in the cold air, began to warm as the day stretched out before her. Each step felt deliberate, each movement taking her closer to the unknown. And yet, despite the uncertainty of the world around her, there was no fear. There was only the quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, she was ready to meet it. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft rustling of the trees as they swayed in the morning breeze. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that settled into her soul like a familiar comfort. The landscape before her was both unfamiliar and yet deeply familiar, like a place she had always known but had never truly seen. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking out across the vast, snowy expanse that stretched before her. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadowed depths a reminder of the mysteries that still lingered beyond the horizon. But Ingrid no longer felt the weight of those mysteries pressing in on her. She had walked through them, and now she stood on the other side. A place where the light was beginning to break through, a place where anything was possible. As she stood there, the sun now fully risen, she felt the ground shift beneath her again. This time, it was not a jolt of energy, not the overwhelming sensation of being pulled somewhere. Instead, it was a gentle vibration, as though the earth itself was responding to her presence. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the sensation, feeling the connection between herself and the world around her. The air was warm, the first breath of spring brushing against her skin, though the snow still clung to the ground. It was the promise of something new, a new beginning, and then, as if summoned by her thoughts, she felt him. Elias. His presence was subtle, like a soft shadow at the edge of her consciousness, but it was unmistakable. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest as she caught sight of him standing there, just beyond the tree line. He was no longer a ghostly image, no longer a flickering memory. He was real, solid. His face was softer now, his expression not one of confusion or fear, but of understanding, of peace. Elias took a step forward, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again. Ingrid's heart raced, not with anxiety, but with anticipation, with hope. She had walked through the darkness, through the unknown, and now she stood at the dawn of something new. The space between them closed, the distance between their hearts shortening with each step he took toward her. When they were close enough, she stopped, just within arm's reach, and they stood there for a moment, wordless, but not silent. Their connection, deeper than anything either of them had ever known, spoke volumes. The light of the day seemed to grow brighter around them, not because the sun had risen higher, but because something within them had shifted. Something that had been dormant was awakening, not just in her, but in him as well. Ingrid didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to ask him if he understood, if he was ready. She knew. He had always known. Their hands brushed, and in that fleeting touch, the world fell away. The past, with its uncertainties and questions, slipped into the background, leaving only the now. The future, still a mystery, no longer seemed daunting. Together, they stood on the edge of something new, something they had both found in the most unexpected of places. Elias took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her, pulling her back into the present. They shared a glance, and in that brief moment, the years of uncertainty and longing seemed to vanish, replaced by something stronger, something undeniable. "We have time," he said, though the words were not spoken aloud. They were simply understood. And with that understanding, they stepped forward together, into the unknown, side by side. The world was theirs to discover, and as the northern lights faded into the distance, the future, no longer a darkened mystery, began to unfold before them. And so, beneath the dawning sky, they walked into the light, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.